Hey guys, welcome back. Another little segment here for you today, hopefully to bring you up to speed as to what occurred that brought us to declare our independence from Britain. And in order to understand that, you've got to work with some prior knowledge that we discussed right here in this very classroom about the French and Indian War. Hopefully you remember how expensive the French and Indian War was for the British colonies. It drained the British treasury, having to ship all of those men, the supplies, from England to North America. So Britain is in some severe financial straits when the war is over with. If you actually recall, we had talked about during the time period, during that French and Indian War, that Britain had turned to the colonies and said, okay, listen, you guys have to start putting money into this too. We're going to start taxing you. And the colonies said, whoa, 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 whoa. You know, you have to ask our permission. We already have governments here. We don't necessarily need your government telling us what to do. We've been paying taxes, but those taxes stay here. What are you going to do for us back in England? And England kind of got this whole, no, we own you mentality. You're going to pay to make this right. Ultimately, the people in England are very upset over the cost of the French and Indian War because they've seen their taxes go through the roof, and they're sitting there saying, we're paying for the brunt of this war, but it wasn't even about where we live. It's for people who live on the other side of the ocean. This is crazy. Why are our taxes going up and the people in the colonies don't have to pay anything? So we start this up, and you got to understand, colonists had been paying taxes, but the majority of the taxes that they were paying were staying in their own colonies. As they go ahead and pay for these taxes, they pay it to, say, the House of Burgesses in Virginia. They go ahead and analyze, this is how much money we have, and then they go ahead and they pay for whatever necessities they had within the colonies from the taxes collected within the colony. Britain had pretty much stayed out of taxing the colonies up to this point, but now facing this financial disaster, they started to say, okay, now that the war is over with, maybe we can come back at these guys and get them to pay their fair share. Parliament sits down and says, yeah, I think we got a solution. We're going to ask the colonies to start to pay some taxes. It's not going to be a lot. It's going to be the first time they're going to see a lot of taxes. But up to this point, they really hadn't had any taxes. There's a little tax that was put on sugar once upon a time that it's just going to mention here. It's not going to be on your test. But that tax on sugar was short-lived. First of all, the first tax had made it so expensive that nobody could afford sugar. Secondly, basically Grenville, the guy in charge of the Treasury, says, okay, well, here's the deal. We're going to cut the tax in half, but I want British Navy to really patrol the waters to stop the molasses, the sweetener at the time, to be smuggled back and forth among the colonies. So once they stepped up those British patrols and cut the tax in half, a lot of the colonists said, listen, we're just going to stop buying it altogether. We don't like this idea. So it's worth mentioning here, but it won't be on your test. Okay? So for right now, that's a good place for us to get started, and we'll just pick it up right there. Okay? Okay, so as I said, the British Treasury is looking around for money. The Sugar Act comes along, but it's kind of short-lived because people aren't going to be buying the molasses that's being used to sweeten rum and things like that anymore. They just basically boycott it, which means they're not going to buy it. So Britain once again is forced with coming up with a new strategy. Now they come up with something called the Stamp Act. Now the Stamp Act is a little bit different than everything else tried in the colonies up to this point, and I promise you the colonists are not going to like this idea. The Stamp Act puts taxes on last wills and testaments, diplomas, newspapers. Over here hiding behind me right now are marriage papers, almanacs, playing cards and dice, games of chance, things like that. And Britain says, we'll tax those. And the reason it was called a Stamp Act is because you actually stamped it after you had purchased it to say that, the tax had been paid. So Britain had been using these widely for many, many, many years, but no one in the colonies had seen anything like this yet. Okay, look at that. I just jumped again. Look, and maybe to understand how these taxes work, you've got to understand the whole process. When you pay taxes, basically that entitles you to have someone who is going to listen to your concerns. Today, we pay taxes. That means we have representatives at the state and federal levels. These are some of your representatives from Pennsylvania. So basically, because you're a taxpayer, you can pick up the phone or email or write any of those representatives and tell them how you feel on particular issues. And it's the representative's job to hopefully represent the will of the people. So basically what had the colonists so upset is that they don't have representation. So they said, look, if you will give us representation back home in Parliament in England, then we will pay the taxes. That's basically what this whole argument is going to boil down to. And of course, most of the people in England think it's crazy already because they're paying more in taxes. So there you go. There's the gist of the idea so far. So let's keep going here. Ultimately, what winds up happening is the colonists say, look, give us a representative to hear our voices in England, and we will gladly pay that tax. The English citizens are saying, no way, that's not fair. They're going to get the same thing we get in England. In England, we're paying taxes and we get a voice in Parliament, but our taxes are much higher than what we're asking the colonists to pay. So that's not right. After a lot of debate, back and forth by both sides, they begin to realize this is not going anywhere. And plus, the colonists have stopped buying things like newspapers, playing cards, dice, almanacs. They are boycotting those products as well. Those products are being shipped here from England. And the people back in England who are trying to sell those things, their business is being hurt. So they turn around to Parliament and go, let's stop. You're hurting us here by taxing on those particular items. Stop doing it. And Parliament goes, all right, fine. We are going to repeal those acts and take them, down for a while. So I guess you could say chalk one up for the colonists under the Stamp Act. Okay, so despite the fact that maybe we had won that first victory against the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act comes along next. And the Townshend Act really sets the colonies off. Understand what the Townshend Act was. They're still in debt. People in England are still paying way more in taxes for a war that was fought here. Colonists aren't paying their fair share by the viewpoint of English citizens. So we're still trying to figure out how we're going to get this done. England is still reeling in financial debt, and they want to turn to the colonies and ask them to start to pay their fair share. So basically, all of this is really tense back in England right now. You have two guys of the British Parliament. Their names were George Grenville and Charles Townshend. They're both fighting publicly, almost in what you and I would call Congress. They're yelling back and forth at each other. And what winds up happening is Grenville charges Townshend with being a coward. He says, you're afraid to tax the colonists. You're being a wuss. So what winds up happening is, I guess, Townshend says, you think I'm afraid of those colonists? I'll show you. I'll tax the colonies. And the very next month, they pass what is known as the Townshend Act. Notice, named after Charles Townshend. So I'll move here again. This is tricky, I guess. Sorry. The Townshend Act taxes items like glass, paper, lead, paint, and tea. Don't forget tea. It's going to be important, okay? So with these particular things taxed, here we go. We got to fly around again. I apologize on this one, guys. I did not set it up thinking that I had to leave a little window. With the Townshend Act, there is something else included called the writ of assistance. You remember, under the Sugar Act that I told you about at the start of this video, they wanted the Navy patrols to beef up Navy patrols and make sure that they weren't smuggling the goods. Well, England still thinks that the colonies are smuggling in goods. They might be boycotting them from England, but they're bringing them in from somewhere else. So this is passed to stop that smuggling. Basically, here's what it's telling you. The Townshend Act included a little piece to help tax collectors in the colonies get those taxes. Custom officials were sent to America with orders to stop smuggling. Parliament issued the writ of assistance. The writ of assistance would allow British officers to board and inspect a ship's cargo without having to give a reason. So any boat that's docked here, we're going to go on this one and search it. Colonists immediately argued that the writ of assistance violated their English Bill of Rights. If anyone's going to come into your personal home or your property or even your place of business, be it a ship or a store, you had to have a reason to search it. And with the writ of assistance, they didn't need one. It was to stop smuggling. The colonists boycott the products taxed under the Townshend Act, tea and lead and paint. But they began these public demonstrations, and they began making what you and I know as effigies. They are basically scarecrows that were dressed up to look like British tax collectors, and they hung them from lampposts, from trees, set them on fire. Kind of an intimidating thing if you're a tax collector in the colonies, if you can imagine. So today, it's just worth mentioning that here in America, we have something that sort of protects us from this. It's called a search warrant. It's provided under your Fourth Amendment. Basically, the process is if the police believe you have something in your home, your car, your place of work, they need to go to a judge, and they need to say, here's what we think they have. The judge says, why do you think that? And they give evidence to support why they think it. And then they also have to list specifically what they're looking for. If a judge says, yeah, there's grounds for this, the judge signs off on it, and that's how a search warrant works. But the writ of assistance wasn't like that. Again, the colonists are very upset about this. They're boycotting their goods. They're getting more and more violent in their demonstrations. The writ of assistance has them like all scared to death. And the Townshend Act is repealed with one small exception. You want to take a guess at what wasn't repealed? The tax on tea. You know, this is done by Parliament just to show that they still have a right to tax items on the colonists, whether the colonists like it or not. So they leave this teeny tiny little tax. I mean, it wasn't something that was costing the colonies a lot, but it was just sort of a, hey, see, if you continue to buy tea from us, you're showing, yeah, you give, and we do have the right to tax you. Doesn't seem like much. I get it, but it is going to be a big, big deal soon. How about a pop quiz? No, this isn't going to be a quiz on the slides that were before, just to kind of see what you might guess. Here's the pop quiz, okay? For every dollar that the colonists were paying in taxes to England, how much do you think citizens still living in England were paying? So the question here is, the colonies, how much are they paying compared to what England is paying? If the colonists are paying $1, how much are people living in England paying? Think about it for a second. How much? You ready? It's going to surprise you. Yeah, $100. They were basically paying 100 times the amount of taxes that the colonies were paying. So you can kind of see now why England is going, are you kidding me? These guys are complaining about paying $1 in taxes when we have to pay $100 in taxes. So yeah, they both had very valid arguments. So as you can see, this is not an easy argument. There's no real clear winner here. Both sides had their valid points. When you consider what the colonists had to say, the colonists claimed that if Britain would just give them a voice in Parliament to represent the concerns, that they would pay the taxes. But Britain is going, you've lost your mind. There's no way the people in the colonies should get a voice in Parliament because they're paying 1/100th of what the citizens in England were paying. Plus, Britain claimed that the colonists should simply pay the tax because Britain had almost run itself bankrupt trying to save them from the French. And so we come up with this new little phrase that becomes very popular in the colonies, and we still have heard it today. No taxation without representation. What does that mean? It means that you do not have a right to tax me without giving me some way of having my voice heard in government. That's the plain and simple deal. And really, when it all boils down to it, that's what the colonists were upset about. They said, okay, fine, we'll pay you ridiculous tax, but you must give us a voice in government. That goes back to an idea established a long time ago in 1215 in the Magna Carta. We'll talk about that a little bit in class too, but ultimately this was a piece of paper that a king was forced to sign, and it said that you have to get permission from the people before you tax them. There's a little bit of irony here too when you look at the history of the Townshend Act. The very same day that Parliament decides to repeal the Townshend Act in the colonies, and understand that when they would make a decision back in England, it took some time for the decision to reach America. So the very same day that Parliament says, okay, fine, we'll take back the Townshend Act, the Boston Massacre occurs. You know, and ultimately this is a thing that almost fuels a lot of hatred. The Sons of Liberty, an organization put together to try to fan the anti-British sentiments in the colonies, really uses this as a stepping stone to make people angry at Britain. Okay, so here's the question. What caused the Boston Massacre? Well, probably the long and the short of it is going to be a real simple answer. Alcohol. There had been a group of sailors who had been inside drinking, and when they came out, they see these British soldiers standing there, and they begin to say not nice things to them. And as they're yelling at them, more and more people begin to gather, and pretty soon you've got a mob there in front of these groups of people. They're feeling very brave because they have a mob-like mentality, and they're getting more and more brave and getting in the faces of these soldiers. So how many colonists were killed in the Boston Massacre? I mean, it's a massacre, right? What, 1,000? 500? Ultimately, the answer is 5. Now, who drew blood first? Because that would be a key point too. It's clearly got to be Britain, right? Britain pulls up the guns and starts shooting. Doesn't really happen that way. In the real history, what you have is you have a group of very angry people who decide that they're going to start throwing snowballs and chunks of seashells packed in the snowballs and ice balls and things like that at those British soldiers. A very intimidating thing to do if you're a soldier standing there and there's an angry mob in front of you. And ultimately, one soldier is struck in the head and he begins to bleed. As you can imagine, that's probably a pretty scary thing, that group of people yelling at you, and then you look over and one of your buddies is laying there bleeding from the head. It's not much longer after that that one of the soldiers panics. And when his musket fires, the other soldiers standing next to him fire, and when the smoke clears, 5 people are laying there dead. Interestingly enough, all of those soldiers were immediately arrested and kept in the colonies, and they're trying to figure out what to do with these guys. So they put them on trial, and the man who steps forward is none other than John Adams. John Adams says, now this is important. I want to make sure that these guys get a fair trial so that the world can see that we're just not out to be bullies to Britain. A lot of people kind of think that that's wrong of Adams to defend these soldiers who have fired onto a group of unarmed citizens. And Adams, in his argument, says essentially that the crowd provoked those soldiers, and they pretty much get off. The worst punishment that any of them get is the one soldier who panics first and fires gets a brand put on his hand, like a hot piece of metal pressed there that burns an image into his hand. And that image basically means that he's responsible for the death of someone. So now the Stamp Act has been repealed, the Townshend Act has been repealed. Britain is still in financial straits. The citizens of England are very angry because the colonies still aren't paying their fair share. And now you've got another problem. You have this company called the British East India Company, who has a boatload and a warehouse full of tea. The colonies are no longer buying it because, remember, under the Townshend Act, they left that little tax on tea. Well, the colonies aren't stupid. They know there's still a tax there, and they've refused to buy tea from England. This British East India Company is this huge shipping company, and they're about to go out of business. They're very concerned, and they say to Parliament, listen, if we go out of business, this is your fault. And if we go out of business, that's really going to hurt Britain's economy. You know, you've got to liken them to today's maybe FedEx or UPS. It's a huge company. So Parliament starts going, okay, think. How can we fix this? And they come up with something called the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act is not a tax on tea. Tea was taxed under the Townshend Act. So now what you've got to do is understand, how are we going to play this out? And in order to do that, you got to understand all parts. First, the British East India Company was the company who had a ton of tea left over because colonists weren't buying it. Now, imagine a store owner in the colonies by the name of Mr. Krabs. He's got a shop and he sells tea. He is a tea merchant living in the colonies. He's one of the colonists who just simply sells tea. But you got to understand, if you're selling tea, you're going to buy the tea from Britain, and you're going to mark it up a little bit before you sell it to make a profit yourself. And then last but not least, we'll bring in the last player here. The last player is going to be, I don't know, a guy named Mr. Cranach who lives in the colonies. This man is simply buying tea from Mr. Krabs. Okay? Now you got all the players. We can figure this out. Okay. So, as I said before, what you have is this British East India Company has a huge warehouse full of tea. They're about to go out of business, and they turn around to Parliament and go, listen, you made this mess. Now fix it before we go out of business. And they say, you know, if you don't help us, we're going out of business. So what are we going to do? Parliament comes up with a pretty radical idea, but they think everyone's going to like this idea. So basically, they say, this idea that we've come up with is going to help the British East India Company. It's going to help the colonies. This is a good deal. But they are shocked at colonial reaction to this Tea Act. Okay, so here's how it worked. I want you to think up here. Here's England, and I know I'll get you, your bearings. This is Florida down here, so this is the east coast of the United States. Here's how it worked. The British East India Company would sail from England with tea, and they would deliver it to those tea merchants that you see over here, okay? They would say $1 per pound. This is just my example. They weren't really charging $1 per pound, but I want you to see the example. So then they would take it and they'd go to the next port, to the next tea merchant. They would unload $1 per pound, and they would go to the next port and unload $1 per pound, and they charged the tea merchants all the same. Okay? No problem. You get it? Good. All right. So here's what happened from there. After the British East India Company sells the tea to the merchants for a certain price, the merchants then sell the tea to colonial buyers, Mr. Cranach here, to make a little profit, they would bump it up just a little bit. Okay, so there you go. Hey, all right. And that's $1.50 per pound, please. So notice they're making 50 cents, for example. So what the Tea Act did was cut out the middleman. The colonial merchants, Mr. Crabs, were informed they're no longer allowed to sell the tea to the colonists. Instead, colonists, like Mr. Cranach, would have to go down to the docks and buy their tea right off from the boat that was a representative for the British East India Company. Because the middleman was cut out, it actually lowered the price of tea. So now these colonists were buying the tea for a rate that was less than before. But if you notice, the British East India Company was making a little bit more. They had been selling it for $1 a pound. They bump it up just a wee bit to make a little bit more money to recover the losses that they were losing from all the tea sitting in the warehouse. But the colonists are going, hey, $1.25. Well, let me get out of the way. $1.25 is a good price for tea. So what goes wrong? How could this go wrong? Everybody should be happy, right? What surprised both Parliament and the British East India Company was that the colonists, despite saving a couple of bucks, turned around and said, I feel bad for those colonial merchants. I feel bad for Mr. Crabs. They decided that since Mr. Crabs was a colonial, living in the colonies, merchant, just trying to get by, just trying to provide for his family, that they would choose to stick by him. And they continue to boycott the British tea. You've got Mr. Cranach here saying, oh, I feel bad for that guy. What am I going to do to help him out? And you've got poor Mr. Crabs going, me money. It's not hard to imagine. You know, what would happen to a colonial merchant's tea shop if they're not permitted to sell the tea any longer? So the colonists are sitting here and they're protesting the Tea Act. Britain's not doing anything about it. The British East India Company is still very stressed over how are we going to get the colonists to buy our tea. And you have Enter the Sons of Liberty. They sit down and they start saying, listen, we need to stage a protest that is really going to get the attention of Britain and Parliament to let them know how we feel. Well, ultimately, Britain is refusing to repeal the Tea Act and colonists do something about it. They wind up tossing the tea into the ocean. And you know what? The Boston Tea Party is born. It's just worth pointing out, you know, these Sons of Liberty, this is the flag that should look familiar to you guys. Down here is another artist rendition of Native Americans aboard a ship throwing bales of tea over into the harbor of Boston. Over here is another artist rendition, but it's important to remember that they didn't dress as Native Americans thinking that they were going to fool British officials, that Native Americans, for some crazy reason, just broke onto a ship and threw all the tea overboard. They didn't think Britain would buy it for a second, but instead they were dressed as Native Americans only to hide their own personal identities. Uh-oh, we've made the big guy angry. When the King of England hears about the Tea Party, he's not amused. In fact, he's downright angry. He immediately moves to punish the city of Boston and its residents with what the colonists call the Intolerable Acts. Now, in no particular order, I'll go through these. Intolerable Act number 1, no town meetings more than once a year without permission from the king himself. Can you guess why? Come on, think about it. The Boston Tea Party took tremendous planning. And the king says, you know what, we're not going to let these guys get together anymore to start planning something big like that again. So if they were caught together in a large group, it was considered a conspiracy against the throne. So that's the first one. Again, not in particular order, but no town meetings without permission. The second one actually closed down the port of Boston completely. No ships out, no ships in. If you had goods that you needed to ship off to England, too bad. If you were waiting for a supply of anything to come in from England, too bad. This alarmed the colonies all up and down the coast. And, you know, the colonies to the south of Boston start shipping up wagons of food and goods that they needed because essentially, you know, the king, I guess, is ready to starve out Boston if he has to. Okay, the third part to the Intolerable Act was basically British troops. It was called the Quartering Act. British troops are now allowed to stay inside your home if they have nowhere else to stay. You had to provide candles, blankets, some food items. A lot of the colonists are already angry that Britain has troops there. We're not at war. Why are British soldiers here? And now the king says, and you've got to provide housing for them. That's not something that the colonists are ready to hear, and they're pretty upset over it. Okay, so, you know, here they come in the middle of the night. What do? You got Paul Revere going, who is it? Okay, so, and here's the last one. You know, I will admit I'm being dramatic about this last one, but British officials who are charged with a crime will no longer have their trials held in Canada. Will no longer have their trials held in the colonies. Instead, they're going to be tried in Canada or England. Now, remember, Adams defended those soldiers during the Boston Massacre, and they got off with very minimal punishments. Despite that, the king says, I don't think that those colonists would give any British official a fair trial in the colonies anymore. So no longer will they stand trial. Here's the dramatic part. You can try to imagine, a British soldier saying, yeah, I just mistreated the colonists. I stole their money. And now my trial is going to take me home. I'm going to go back to England. I don't have to stay here in the colonies anymore. Ha ha ha. Chew on that, you stinking colonial dogs. So, here it comes. Now, this is the big one. And I want you to focus in on this one a little bit, okay? I'm going to get out of the way here. Colonists decide that since the king sent troops to enforce his new laws, and we're not at war with England, must be the king sees this as war. The colonists say, we better get ready for some trouble to go down. They began stockpiling weapons in the towns of Lexington. Loyalists observe colonists taking their guns into a shop, and the loyalists go running over to British officers saying, hey, listen, we've seen them. They're taking guns in there right now. You've got to get over there and get them. So the British decide, you know what? I think we better go down there and get those guns away from them before they do something stupid. What happens next goes down in history as the midnight ride of Paul Revere, as riders who'd been watching for the British troops to start moving observe them moving, and they start hanging the lanterns in the towers, and you know the whole story, one if by land, one if by sea. But messengers ride out across the countryside to warn the minutemen that the British troops are coming, to arms, to arms. They're telling them, go down and get your guns that you had stockpiled in there. You need them now because the British are coming. Now, at Lexington, the first battle, the colonial troops are scattered very quickly. I mean, basically, the British show up, and, they're all lined up across the field, and here's just dumb country bumpkin hick farmers standing on the other side of the field, all sweaty palm and everything, looking at the strongest military force on the planet at the time. And the British soldiers say, go home, boys. You don't want any of this. Someone fires, there's ideas about who may have fired first. It may have been somebody who wasn't even out on the battlefield. We're not really sure. But ultimately, somebody fires. The British fire off. Many of those colonists who are standing there take off running. But they go just down the road to the next town, Concord, and there they gather up again. And as the British show up this time, the British find out that the colonists are a little more resolved. They are better prepared. They are ready to fight this time. And they actually turn those British soldiers back. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the beginning of the American Revolution. Those first shots fired at Lexington and Concord really shake up the world. You finally have colonists raising guns and shooting at British soldiers. The colonists figure, hey, especially in New England now, the colonists figure, hey, the king already sent soldiers here. He sees that we're at war already. Well, if he believes we're at war, let's give him one. So there you go. That's how it all began, and it's why we've decided that it's time for us to break away. I hope it's cleared some things up. I hope it explains it a little bit better. But until next time, take care.